Hey everyone! Tonight we're uncovering the most terrifying truth about death, that sometimes it fails to take everything when it leaves, creating hollow shells that wear familiar faces but carry nothing inside. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready to discover why every culture developed desperate rituals to keep the dead properly dead. And let me know in the comments if you've ever looked into someone's eyes and seen nothing looking back. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to explore the soulless dead who rise not as the people they were, but as broken fragments seeking what they can never find. Without further ado, let's begin. The dead man's eyes should close. They should close and stay closed, weighted down with coins or shells or smooth river stones, sealed against the world of light and breath and warmth. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they flutter open in the darkness of the tomb, and what looks back is not the person who died. This is the first terror, the oldest fear, that death might not be clean. In the sweltering nights of ancient Mesopotamia, when the wind carries sand that tastes of bone and forgotten prayers, the priests know this truth. A soul is not one thing but many. The breath that leaves the body at death, the shadow that falls behind the living, the names spoken by loved ones. Each piece must find its proper path, or none will rest. The Sumerians call them different names, trace their journeys on clay tablets that crack in the desert heat, but the message carved into every line remains the same. What seems like one death is actually 7 departures, and any one of them can fail. The scribes write by lamplight of bodies that breathe without souls, of shadows that walk while their owners sleep. They know that death is not a door, but a dismantling, piece by careful piece, and sometimes the work is left unfinished. Walk north, through the marshes where the Nile spreads its fingers into the delta, and the priests of Egypt whisper of the same division. Here they name the pieces, Ka and Ba, Ren and Sekhem, each as vital as breath itself. The Ka, the double, the life force that mirrors the body, must journey to the afterlife, but it tethers to flesh and bone and memory. Should the body decay too quickly, should the rituals fail, should the name be forgotten or the tomb defiled, the K remains behind. It wears the corpse like an ill-fitting mask, animating flesh that no longer remembers love or laughter or the weight of tears. In the burial chambers beneath Memphis, the embalmers work with the precision of surgeons and the reverence of priests. Every organ wrapped, every bone positioned, every spell carved into gold and stone, because they have seen what happens when the process fails. They have seen the hollow ones, the reanimated husks that wear familiar faces, but speak with voices like wind through broken pottery. The Ba, the personality, the essence of what made the dead person them, should soar as a bird with a human head, free to travel between worlds. But trauma can cage it, violence can shatter it, improper burial can trap it in flesh that grows cold and stiff and hungry. The Egyptians understand. A broken death creates a broken resurrection, and the broken dead are never kind to the living. Move further north still, to the long halls of Scandinavia, where the aurora paints the winter sky in shades of green and gold. Here, in the smoke of hearth fires and the gleam of iron axes, the Norse tell stories of the Fylgja, the spirit double that follows every living person, like a faithful hound. At death, the Fylgja should depart with the soul, journeying to whatever realm awaits. But anger can bind it to the corpse, hatred can anchor it to the world of flesh and blood and vengeance. The skalds sing of warriors who die badly, poisoned, murdered in their sleep, struck down by treachery, and how their Fylgja refuses to let go. It inhabits the corpse like a bitter ghost, driving the dead body to walk and fight and seek revenge. These are the Draugr, the afterwalkers, the hollow men who remember only rage and the taste of blood on their tongues. In every tale, in every culture that has learned to fear the dark, the pattern repeats. The soul is not simple, death is not clean, and the most terrible returners are those who come back incomplete. Travel east, through the dark forests of Slavic lands where the trees grow so thick that noon feels like twilight. The Babas and the wise women know the dusha from the duk, the soul breath from the spirit shadow. They understand that each person carries multiple selves, and death must release them all, or none will find peace. The dusha, they whisper, is like a bird that must learn to fly. If death comes suddenly, violently, without proper preparation or blessing, the dusha may panic, may cling to the familiar weight of flesh rather than trust itself to the unknown sky. It nestles in the cooling body like a sparrow afraid of the storm, and what awakens is neither fully alive nor properly dead. These Slavic hollow ones wander through the midnight forests, drawn to the warmth of living homes, pressing their faces against windows to stare at the families they can no longer remember how to love. Their eyes hold no recognition, no spark of the person they once were, only a terrible, aching emptiness that seeks to fill itself with the life force of others. The Celtic druids, painting their faces with woad beneath the ancient oaks, speak of the fetch, the double that every person casts like a shadow. At the moment of death, the fetch should merge with the departing soul, becoming whole and complete for the journey to the other world. But violent death, sudden death, cursed death can split them apart. The soul flees to whatever judgment awaits, but the fetch remains, wearing the body like a discarded coat, hollow as a reed and twice as hungry. In the stone circles and the sacred groves, the druids perform the rites of binding and releasing, ensuring that all the scattered pieces of a person's essence find their proper paths. They know that death without ritual is like a shattered mirror. The pieces may reflect something that looks human, but the reflection is broken, distorted, wrong. From the temples of ancient Greece comes the understanding that death is a journey requiring guides. The psychopomps, Hermes with his winged sandals, Thanatos with his gentle touch, are meant to shepherd souls across the threshold between worlds. But what happens when the guides fail to appear? What happens when the soul, confused by sudden death or weighed down by unfinished business, refuses to follow? The Greeks tell of the eidolon, the image double that should dissolve at death like salt in water. When it persists, when it animates the abandoned flesh, it creates something that looks alive, but possesses no more substance than a reflection in dark water. The eidolon remembers the shape of human behavior, but not its meaning. It goes through the motions of life, like an actor who has forgotten their lines, and the performance is always, inevitably, wrong. This is why the ancient world developed its elaborate death rituals, its complex funeral rites, its careful attention to the bodies of the dead. Every culture that has learned to fear the darkness understands. Death is not an event, but a process, and processes can fail. The archaeologists, digging in the cold earth of European burial grounds, find the evidence carved in bone and stone. Skeletons buried face down, their view of the heavens blocked by dirt and clay. Bodies pinned beneath heavy stones as if something tried to claw its way out. Skulls severed from spines, hands bound with iron chains, mouths filled with stones or bricks or clumps of earth. These are not the graves of honored dead, but of the feared dead, the ones who might return incomplete. The living took no chances. They weighted the bodies, bound the limbs, broke the bones, did everything they could think of to ensure that if the soul pieces scattered, if the death journey failed, if the hollow ones tried to rise, they would find only darkness and earth and the implacable weight of stone. In Hungary, they buried the suspected vampires with their mouths full of stones and their bodies pinned beneath mill wheels. In Romania, they drove iron stakes through the heart and scattered poppy seeds around the grave. The living would have time to run while the hollow dead counted every seed. Across Eastern Europe, the archaeologists find burial after burial that speaks of desperate fear. Fear of the dead who return with empty eyes and hungry mouths. fear of loved ones who come back wearing familiar faces but carrying alien souls. The ancient Egyptians developed mummification not just to preserve the body, but to provide a perfect vessel for the soul pieces to inhabit should they return from their celestial journey. Every organ carefully preserved, every finger wrapped in linen, every facial feature maintained with resins and oils, because they understood that a broken body could only house a broken soul. But even their elaborate preparations sometimes failed. In the desert tombs, archaeologists find mummies that have been violated not by grave robbers, but from within. Bodies that have clawed their way out of their wrappings, leaving shredded linen and the marks of desperate fingernails. The Egyptians had a word for these, the Isfet, those who returned in opposition to Ma'at, the cosmic order. They were neither alive nor dead, but something caught between, hollow echoes of their former selves. The Tibetan understanding of the Bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth, acknowledges that the journey through death takes 49 days, and at any point, the process can go wrong. The consciousness can become confused, lost, drawn back to the decaying body by attachment or fear. When this happens, what returns is not the person who died, but a fragment, a shadow, a hungry ghost wearing their face. The ancient world was full of these half-deaths, these incomplete departures. Every culture developed its own understanding of how the soul could fracture, how death could fail, how the beloved dead could return as something terrible and strange. They understood that the human spirit is complex, layered, capable of breaking in ways that leave some pieces trapped in the cooling flesh, while others scatter like leaves in an autumn wind. This is the first lesson of the Hollow Ones. Death is not the opposite of life, but its most complicated moment, when everything that makes a person human must somehow find its way from one world to another. And sometimes the journey fails. Sometimes the travelers get lost. Sometimes what arrives at the destination is not the soul that departed, but an empty vessel, a broken mirror, a hunger wearing a human face. The dead man's eyes should close. They should stay closed, but sometimes they open. And when they do, what looks back remembers the shape of love, but not its warmth, the motions of speech, but not its meaning, the hunger for life, but not its joy. This is how the Hollow Ones are born, not in malice, but in failure, not from evil, but from incompleteness, not because they choose to return, but because some part of them never learned how to leave. The ancient world knew this truth and carved it into every stone, wove it into every ritual, whispered it in every prayer for the dead. The soul that leaves in pieces may return the same way, and what comes back will be less than what departed. The Hollow Ones are not the opposite of the living. They are the living, broken. The ground above Glam's grave cracks like a bone breaking. Not the soft settling of earth over a peaceful corpse, but the violent upheaval of something forcing its way out from below. The shepherds find the split earth at dawn, black soil scattered like a wound across the Icelandic hillside, and they know death has failed to hold. This is not resurrection. This is something else entirely. In the firelight of the Great Hall, the Scalds tell the true story, the one that makes strong men reach for their weapons and mothers pull their children close. Glam was a shepherd, surly and strange even in life, found dead in the snow after a night of hunting something that left tracks too large for any wolf. They buried him according to custom, spoke the proper words, laid the stones in the proper pattern. Death should have been the end of his story. Instead, it was the beginning of his horror. The thing that crawls from Glam's grave still wears his face, still moves with his heavy gait, but the eyes are empty as winter sky. No recognition flickers there when it sees the men who worked beside him, the women who served him ale, the children who ran from his harsh words. It knows their shapes, their scents, their habits, but it remembers them the way a wolf remembers sheep, not as individuals, but as prey. The Gretti's saga tells us what the hollow dead remember: hunger, hatred, and the weight of their own bones. Glam's Draugr stalks the living through the long Arctic nights, not from malice, but from a terrible emptiness that seeks to fill itself with their warmth. It tears the roofs from houses with hands that feel no cold, chases horses until their hearts burst from terror, sits on sleeping men until they wake gasping and mad. But when they try to speak to it, to reason with it as they would with the Glam they knew, it tilts its head like a dog hearing a sound it cannot understand. The words wash over it, meaningless as rain. The person who might have responded is gone, and what remains knows only need. This is the first face of the Hollow Ones, the physical returner, the walking corpse animated by fragments too small and broken to be called a soul. Travel south to the mist-shrouded shores of Britain, where the monks scratch their chronicles by candlelight and the local people whisper stories older than the stones of their churches. Here, in the writings of William of Newburgh, the pattern reveals itself again and again. The dead who return, but return wrong. At Melrose Abbey, a chaplain dies in sin and shame, his body hastily buried in unconsecrated ground. But death brings no peace, no forgiveness, no rest. The thing that rises from his grave wears his face like a mask that fits poorly. It shambles through the monastery corridors at midnight, its footsteps echoing hollow on the stone floors. But when the brothers try to speak with it, to offer prayers or absolution, it stares at them with the fixed, unblinking gaze of a hunting cat. The monks describe it in their careful Latin, corpus sin anima, a body without a soul. It performs the motions of its former life, walking the paths it walked in life, entering the chapel where it once said Mass. But the performance is empty, mechanical, like a water wheel turning without purpose. The chaplain's knowledge is gone, his personality erased, his capacity for guilt or redemption dissolved into nothing. What remains is merely flesh that moves, animated by some fragment too small to be called consciousness. The townspeople of Berwick tell a similar tale of a merchant who dies owing debts and favours, his affairs left in chaos, his family abandoned to poverty. His body goes into the ground heavy with unfinished business, and what rises 3 nights later remembers only the shape of urgency, the weight of incompletion. It wanders through the market squares, where he once conducted business, approaches the stalls he once frequented. But when the vendors try to speak with it, they find themselves staring into eyes that hold no recognition, no memory of shared transactions or familiar faces. The hollow merchant moves through its former haunts like a sleepwalker, driven by patterns carved too deep to erase, but lacking the consciousness to understand them. It reaches for coins it cannot count, speaks words that carry no meaning, performs the rituals of commerce with the dedication of the mad. The townspeople flee not from malevolence, but from the unbearable wrongness of familiarity without recognition, love without reciprocation, humanity without a human soul. But it is in the Germanic forests, beneath the cathedral canopies of oak and elm, that the nature of the hollow dead becomes most clear. Here, the chronicles speak not of individual revenants, but of entire categories, of the incomplete dead. Plague victims who rise with empty eyes and grasping hands. Murderers who return driven by violence they no longer understand. Oath breakers who walk the earth seeking to fulfill promises they can no longer remember. The Germanic understanding is precise, surgical in its horror. The dead who return do so not because they choose to, but because some essential part of the dying process has been interrupted. The personality, the memory, the spark of individual will, all of these require a complete soul to sustain them. And when the soul fragments or fails to depart entirely, what remains in the body is insufficient to maintain human consciousness. These Germanic hollow ones move with the purposefulness of the living, but the emptiness of the dead. A murdered woman might return to her cottage night after night, performing the routines of housekeeping with mechanical precision, sweeping floors that need no cleaning, preparing meals no one will eat, tending children who are no longer there. She remembers the actions, but not their meaning, the habits, but not their purpose. The most chilling accounts come from families who try to reclaim their hollow dead, to welcome them back as if nothing has changed. A father recognizes his son's face, his voice, his familiar gestures, and opens his door with joy and relief. But as the hours pass, the terrible truth becomes clear. The son knows his father's face, but not his name, recognizes the house, but not its significance, performs the motions of filial love with the empty precision of a trained animal. The father speaks of shared memories, and the son tilts his head in polite confusion. He mentions the son's childhood, his fears and dreams and favorite foods, and receives only a blank, patient stare. The son responds to direct commands. Sit here, eat this, sleep now, but initiates nothing, chooses nothing, wants nothing beyond the basic drives that animate all corpses: warmth, movement, the proximity of life. This is the particular horror of the hollow dead. They are familiar enough to fool the heart, but empty enough to break it. The Eastern European understanding adds another layer to the picture. In the Carpathian villages where the wolves howl and the forests grow thick as fur, the people know that the hollow dead are marked by specific absences. They cast no shadows because shadows require substance, depth, and inner light to block. They show no reflections because reflections need something genuine to reflect. Their breath creates no mist in the cold air because breath requires the warmth of a living soul to give it substance. These are not supernatural powers, but supernatural lacks. The absence of qualities that require completeness to manifest. A whole soul casts a shadow, creates reflections, warms the air with its breath. A fragment cannot manage such complex interactions with the physical world. It can animate flesh, direct movement, even mimic speech, but it cannot create the subtle emanations that mark the truly living. The Slavic Babas, wise in the ways of death and dying, know how to test for these absences. They hold polished metal before suspicious faces, watching for the telltale blank where a reflection should be. They observe footsteps in snow, looking for the sharp, clear prints that lack the fuzzy shadow edge of living walkers. They listen to breathing in the cold night air, waiting for the betraying absence of mist. But the most reliable test is the simplest. They speak of love, of shared joy, of cherished memories, and watch the eyes for the flicker of recognition that never comes. The hollow dead may remember words, faces, even names, but they cannot access the emotional resonance that gives these things meaning. They are libraries with all the books, but none of the understanding, actors who know their lines but have forgotten how to feel. The Norse sagas give us the most detailed accounts of how the hollow dead interact with the living world. Glam's Draugr possesses superhuman strength, not through magical enhancement, but because it feels no pain, no fatigue, no fear of injury. A complete soul monitors the body's limits, protects it from harm, moderates its actions. A fragment lacks such sophistication. It drives the body beyond all reasonable limits, snapping bones and tearing muscles without regard for damage, because it lacks the complexity to understand consequences. The saga tells of Greta's battle with the Draugr, how the creature fights with the relentless persistence of the truly mindless. It feels no discouragement at failure, no pain from wounds, no fear of death, because death has already claimed everything capable of experiencing these things. What remains is pure physical drive, as single-minded as a river flowing toward the sea. But the most telling detail comes at the moment of the Draugr's final destruction. As Greta's blade severs its head from its neck, there is no cry of pain, no final words, no recognition of defeat. The body simply stops moving, like a clockwork mechanism that has finally wound down. There is no moment of peace, no sense of a spirit finally released, only the sudden absence of motion, the transformation from animated corpse to mere meat. This is what marks the true Hollow Ones. Their deaths are not departures, but cessations, not transitions, but endings. They stop because they are broken, not because they choose to leave. The British chronicles add another crucial detail. The hollow dead are often strongest in the places they knew best in life. The chaplain's revenant haunts the abbey where he served. The merchant's spectre walks the markets where he traded. This is not nostalgia or sentimental attachment. Hollow Ones are incapable of such complex emotions. Instead, it suggests that the fragments animating them are incomplete recordings, echoes of the deepest carved patterns of behavior. A soul contains the full complexity of personality, memory, choice, growth, change. A fragment contains only the deepest grooves, the most repetitive actions, the habits so ingrained they require no thought to perform. The hollow dead return to familiar places not from love or longing, but because these are the only patterns their truncated existence can follow. William of Newburgh describes watching a revenant for hours, documenting its behavior with the clinical precision of a natural philosopher. The creature follows the same route night after night, performs the same sequence of actions, responds to the same stimuli in identical ways. It is less like encountering a person than like observing a recurring natural phenomenon, predictable, purposeless, as mindless as the tide. The medieval understanding of these creatures is remarkably sophisticated in its horror. They are not evil because evil requires choice, intention, the ability to understand harm. They are not mad because madness still retains the basic structures of personality and will. They are not possessed because possession implies the presence of another consciousness. They are simply broken. Broken in the most fundamental way possible. They retain the form of humanity while losing its essence, maintain the appearance of consciousness while lacking its substance. They are living proof that the human soul is not indivisible, not indestructible, not guaranteed to survive the trauma of death intact. The hollow dead walk among us wearing the faces of our loved ones, and this is why they inspire such profound dread. They represent not the victory of evil over good, but the failure of completeness, the possibility that death, that final, ultimate transition, might leave us not transformed but merely diminished. They are what we fear we might become, recognizable but not recognized, familiar but not known, human in shape but hollow at the core. The ground above their graves cracks not from the pressure of resurrection, but from the weight of incompleteness, the terrible burden of existing without sufficient substance to justify existence. They rise not in triumph, but in failure, not as conquerors of death, but as its broken children, forever seeking what they can never find, the missing pieces of themselves. And in their empty eyes, we see the reflection of our deepest fear. Not that we might die, but that we might die badly, incompletely, with essential parts of ourselves left scattered and lost in the darkness between worlds. The rope still sways from the gallows tree when they cut him down, the hemp fibers creaking like old bones in the wind. Thomas the cobbler died badly, not just the choking death of the hanged man, but the spiritual suffocation of the unconfessed, the unabsolved, the unforgiven. His body drops into the crossroads grave with a sound like stones falling into a deep well, and the earth that covers him feels heavier than it should, weighted with the knowledge that this death is incomplete. 3 nights later, the crossroads bloom with frost despite the summer heat, and the shepherds find hoofprints in the dirt, not horse tracks, but something else, something that walks on 2 feet but leaves marks like cloven hooves. The dead man's grave lies open like a mouth gasping for air, the dirt scattered in patterns that hurt to look at directly. This is the second face of the hollow ones, not those who return despite proper burial, but those who return because burial was impossible, blessing was denied, death itself was tainted with violence or shame or haste. The crossroads grave is no accident. For centuries, the living have known that certain dead cannot lie in consecrated ground. cannot rest among the blessed, cannot join the community of peaceful sleepers. Suicides, murderers, oathbreakers, those who die in sin. They require special treatment, careful handling, burial in places where their wrongness cannot contaminate the sanctified dead. But the crossroads are more than punishment. They are prophylaxis, protection for the living against the incomplete dead. 4 roads meet at the crossing, and spirits, even broken ones, become confused by the multiplicity of paths. Which way leads home? Which way leads to rest? Which way leads to the world of the living? The hollow dead stand paralyzed by choice, turning in endless circles beneath the gallows tree, unable to commit to any direction. Yet sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the wind blows from the graveyards, they choose. And they always choose wrong. In the Slavic forests, where the trees grow so close their branches weave a ceiling against the sky, the Babas know the Nav, the spirits of those who die before their time, violently, improperly, without the sacred rituals that ensure clean passage from life to death. These are not the peaceful dead who sleep in blessed ground, but the broken dead who wander in the spaces between worlds. The Nav spirits cluster around water, drowned girls who float just beneath the surface of quiet ponds, their hair streaming like weeds, their eyes open but empty of everything that once made them human. They remember the weight of water in their lungs, the pressure of depths against their chest, but they cannot recall their names, their faces, the love that might have saved them. They reach up through the dark water with pale hands, not from malice, but from a desperate need to remember what it felt like to breathe. Children who die unbaptized become Nav spirits, forever caught between the world of the living and the realm of the blessed dead. They appear at windows during winter storms, their faces pressed against the glass like flowers pressed in books, flat, colorless, drained of life but retaining its shape. They cannot cross thresholds uninvited, cannot enter blessed ground, cannot join the community of souls. They exist in the margins, in the forgotten spaces, sustained by fragments too small to constitute true life, but too persistent to fade. The most terrible Nav are those who died in childbirth, mother and child together, their souls tangled like roots in frozen ground. They wander the forest paths at midnight, the mother carrying a bundle that might be swaddling clothes or might be grave shrouds, seeking other mothers to share their burden. But when living women offer help, offer comfort, the Nav mothers stare at them with eyes that hold no maternal recognition, no memory of love or loss or the fierce protectiveness that defines motherhood. They remember the weight of the child, but not its meaning, the pain of birth, but not its joy, the fact of creation, but not its purpose. They are hollow mothers, carrying hollow children, forever seeking something they can never name. The Celtic understanding adds another layer of horror to the picture of improper death. The fetch, the double that every living person casts like a spiritual shadow, should merge with the departing soul at the moment of death, creating wholeness for the journey to the other world. But violent death, sudden death, death without proper preparation, can shatter this merging, leaving the fetch trapped in the cooling body, while the soul flees in terror or confusion. The fetch knows the shape of life, but not its substance. It can mimic the mannerisms of the deceased, wear their face with uncanny accuracy, even speak in their voice, but it lacks the depth that comes from having lived, the complexity that comes from having chosen, the wisdom that comes from having suffered and grown and changed. It is a perfect copy with nothing to copy, a reflection without an original. Irish fishermen tell of seeing their own fetch walking the cliffs on stormy nights, their exact double in every detail except for the eyes, which hold no light, no recognition, no spark of the self that looks back from mirrors. The fetch appears most often to those near death, a harbinger of the end, but also a warning. This is what you will become if your death goes wrong, if the rituals fail, if the journey to the next world is interrupted. The most feared fetch are those of people who die alone, unwitnessed, unmourned, without living voices to speak their names, to remember their deeds, to weave them into the continuing story of the community. These dead become unmoored from meaning. Their fetch wanders the earth seeking someone who will recognize them, claim them, give them the weight of remembered existence. But recognition requires relationship, and relationship requires the capacity for genuine connection, something the fetch, for all its perfect mimicry, utterly lacks. It can perform the gestures of intimacy with flawless precision, but the performance is empty, hollow, a dance without music. The Germanic peoples, with their deep understanding of the relationship between honor and death, know that certain deaths create spiritual pollution. Those who die as oath-breakers, who betray sacred trusts, who violate the bonds that hold community together. Their deaths taint not just their own souls, but the very ground that receives their bodies. These dishonored dead cannot rest in the burial mounds with their ancestors, cannot join the eternal feast in the halls of the gods, cannot participate in the endless cycle of death and rebirth that sustains the cosmos. Instead, they become the Nachtzehrer, the after-devourers, corpses that consume themselves in their graves, gnawing through their own burial shrouds, eating their own flesh in a desperate attempt to fill the emptiness where their honor once resided. The Nachtzehrer remember hunger but not satisfaction, consumption but not nourishment. They devour everything they can reach, their clothing, their coffin wood, eventually their own bodies, but nothing fills the void where their integrity should be. When they exhaust the contents of their graves, they claw their way to the surface and begin feeding on the living, not from vampiric bloodlust, but from the simple, terrible need to put something, anything, into the hollow space where their souls used to be. Archaeological evidence supports these ancient fears. Across Europe, excavations reveal graves that speak of desperate attempts to prevent improper return. Bodies buried face down so they cannot see the sky, cannot orient themselves toward heaven or home. Stones placed on top of corpses, not as markers, but as weights, pressing the dead deep into the earth where they cannot rise. Limbs bound with iron chains, mouths stuffed with stones or bricks, stakes driven through the heart, not from sadistic cruelty, but from intimate knowledge of what happens when death goes wrong. In Hungary, archaeologists find graves where the deceased has been decapitated and the head placed between the legs, a precaution against the hollow dead who might try to reunite body and head through sheer, mindless persistence. Romanian burial sites reveal corpses with iron sickles around their necks, positioned so that any attempt to rise would result in self-decapitation. These are not the graves of enemies but of loved ones, family members, neighbors, community leaders who died badly and whose deaths threatened to infect the living with their incompleteness. The living mourned them even as they chained them, loved them even as they weighted them down with stones. The precautions speak not of hatred, but of heartbreak, the terrible knowledge that sometimes love requires imprisonment, that protection demands betrayal. The beautiful dead and the ugly dead, this distinction appears in folklore across cultures, and it has nothing to do with physical appearance. The beautiful dead are those who die well, surrounded by family, blessed by priests, prepared for the journey with proper ritual and ceremony. Their deaths are complete, clean, whole. They rest peacefully in their graves, their souls safely delivered to whatever realm awaits. The ugly dead are those who die badly, suddenly, violently, alone, unprepared. Murder victims who die with their affairs unfinished, their relationships unresolved, their souls unprepared for departure. Suicide victims who die in despair, their final act a rejection of life itself, their souls damaged by the violence of their own hands. Those who die during eclipses, when the natural order is disrupted and the pathways between worlds become confused. The ugly dead create ugly returns. They rise not as the people they were, but as broken fragments, hollow echoes, distorted reflections of their former selves. They seek not revenge or justice or closure, concepts too complex for their diminished state, but simple, basic completion. They want to finish what was left unfinished, to close what was left open, to resolve what was left hanging. But they lack the mental capacity to accomplish these goals in any meaningful way. Instead, they repeat actions endlessly, mindlessly, like broken clockwork toys. A merchant murdered while counting his gold will rise to count phantom coins forever, his fingers moving through the motions while his eyes stare at nothing. A mother who dies before kissing her child goodnight will wander through houses at midnight, bending over sleeping infants with lips that remember the shape of love but not its meaning. The timing of death matters as much as its manner. Solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, the hours between sunset and sunrise, these are dangerous times to die, when the boundaries between worlds grow thin and the journey from life to death becomes perilous, uncertain. Souls that depart during these periods may become lost, confused, unable to find their proper destination. The eclipse dead are particularly tragic because their incompleteness stems not from moral failure or violent death, but from simple bad timing. They may have lived virtuous lives, died peacefully in their beds, surrounded by loved ones and blessed by priests, but the cosmic disruption of the eclipse interferes with their passage, scatters their souls like seeds in a hurricane. What returns from eclipse deaths are often the gentlest of the hollow ones, sad, confused creatures who wander the earth seeking something they can never quite remember. They appear most often to their living relatives, standing at the foot of beds or in doorways, their faces filled with a terrible, yearning emptiness. They reach out with trembling hands, mouth words that carry no sound, weep tears that hold no sorrow, only the mechanical response of grief without its substance. Regional variations in burial practice reflect local understanding of how death can fail. The Germanic custom of burying oath-breakers at crossroads recognizes that betrayal damages the soul's ability to choose a single, true path. Slavic traditions of placing mirrors in coffins acknowledge that some deaths shatter the soul's wholeness, requiring reflection to restore completeness. Celtic practices of burying the dead with their heads pointing west follow the path of the setting sun, ensuring that confused souls have a clear direction toward the otherworld. But perhaps the most telling tradition is the widespread practice of keeping vigil with the dead, sitting with the body through the nights between death and burial, speaking to the corpse, telling stories, maintaining the continuity of relationship even after breath has ceased. This is not mere sentiment or superstition, but practical spiritual medicine, a recognition that the soul's departure is not instantaneous but gradual, requiring support and guidance during the dangerous transition. The hollow ones are born in those moments when the vigil fails, when the dead are left alone during their most vulnerable hours. Without living voices to anchor them, without the continuous thread of relationship to guide them, the departing soul may panic, may attempt to return to the safety of flesh and bone and familiar sensation. But the soul that returns finds the body already changing, already beginning the transformation from living tissue to mere matter. It cannot fully re-inhabit what it has begun to leave, cannot restore the complex integration of spirit and flesh that defines life. Instead, it achieves only partial reanimation, incomplete restoration, enough animation to move and speak and hunger, but not enough to truly live. This is the central tragedy of the hollow ones. They are caught between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead, sustained by fragments too small to constitute existence, but too large to fade completely. They are the orphans of improper death, the abandoned children of failed passage, the living proof that love alone is not enough to ensure safe delivery from one world to the next. The crossroads graves are full of such orphans, and on nights when the wind blows from 4 directions at once, they remember the weight of choice and the price of choosing poorly. They rise not in triumph, but in confusion, not as conquerors of death, but as its casualties, forever seeking the completion that was stolen from them by violence, haste, neglect, or simple, terrible timing. They are what remains when death is interrupted, when the sacred becomes profane, when the journey that should lead to rest leads only to restless wandering in the spaces between life and peace. The grave diggers find Peter Blagojevich's corpse sitting upright in his coffin, the burial shroud hanging in tatters around his shoulders like the molted skin of some terrible insect. His mouth is stained dark, not with blood, as the stories would have you believe, but with the fabric of his own grave clothes, chewed and swallowed in the desperate hours between midnight and dawn. The shroud that should have wrapped him for eternity hangs in strips, and his belly swells with the cotton and linen of his final garment. This is hunger without appetite, consumption without nourishment, the terrible arithmetic of emptiness, trying to fill itself with whatever lies within reach. The year is 1725, and the village of Kisilova trembles with a fear older than its church bells, older than its memory of saints and saviors. Peter died badly, found collapsed in his fields, his face twisted with pain no physician could diagnose. His last words, a rambling confession that made no sense to the living but perfect sense to the dead. Now, 9 days after they lowered him into the blessed ground, the earth above his grave has settled into a depression like the print of a giant thumb, and the villagers wake to find their livestock drained, their children pale and listless, their own vitality seeping away like water through cracked pottery. The Austrian officials who document his exhumation write in careful, clinical German, but their words carry the tremor of men who have seen the impossible made manifest. The corpse shows no signs of decay. Indeed, it appears more robust than it did in life, the skin taut and flushed, the hair and nails grown long, the body heavy with stolen sustenance. But the eyes are the colour of winter fog, empty of everything that once made Peter Blagojevich a man who could laugh at harvest festivals or weep at his mother's funeral. This is the third face of the hollow ones, not mere walking corpses or confused spirits, but parasites of the living, creatures driven by an emptiness so profound it devours everything within reach, including themselves. The Nachtzehrer of Germanic folklore represents the most literal expression of this consuming void. These are the after-devourers, the corpses that eat their way through death, starting with their burial shrouds and progressing through coffin wood, earth, and eventually their own flesh in a cannibalistic frenzy that speaks of hunger beyond all reason or satisfaction. In the Silesian villages where the wind tastes of snow and sorrow, they know the signs, graves that sink like sighs, the sound of chewing echoing from beneath the earth, the wet, rhythmic noise of something feeding in the darkness below. The Nachtzehrer consumes not from any memory of taste or pleasure. Such complex experiences require a complete soul to process, but from the simple, mechanical drive of emptiness seeking fullness. The villagers describe the sound, not the purposeful chewing of the living, but the mindless, persistent gnawing of something that has forgotten how to stop. It echoes through the cemetery on windless nights, a wet, rhythmic grinding that makes dogs howl and horses refuse to pass the churchyard gate. This is mastication without digestion, feeding without nourishment, the hollow dead trying to fill themselves with matter that cannot possibly satisfy the void where their souls used to reside. But the Nachtzehrer's appetite extends beyond the contents of its own grave. When the burial shroud is consumed, when the coffin wood is gnawed to splinters, when even the corpse's own flesh has been devoured, the creature begins to feed on the lives of its descendants. Not through physical contact, the Nachtzehrer rarely leaves its grave, but through the sympathetic connections that bind family lines like invisible chains. The consumption is gradual, subtle, almost gentle. Children wake with dark circles under their eyes, complaining of dreams where someone calls their name from very far away. Adults find themselves inexplicably exhausted, their energy draining away like water from a cracked vessel. The elderly, already balanced on the edge between worlds, simply fade, not dying of any specific ailment, but losing the will to continue, the spark that separates the living from the merely breathing. This is vampirism without romance, predation without passion, the mechanical extraction of life force by something that remembers hunger, but not satisfaction. The Nachtzehrer does not choose its victims from malice or desire. Such complex motivations require psychological depth it no longer possesses. Instead, it feeds along the lines of least resistance, drawing from those whose life force flows most easily toward the void of its existence. The Romanian Strigoi represent a more active form of this consuming emptiness. Unlike the Nachtzehrer, which feeds from the grave through mystical connections, the Strigoi rises to walk among the living, seeking the warmth of life to fill the cold hollow of its existence. But its predation is not the calculated hunting of the fictional vampire. It is the desperate, clumsy feeding of something that remembers the shape of need, but not its purpose. The Strigoi appears at windows like a moth drawn to flame, pressing its face against the glass with the patient persistence of the truly mindless. It seeks not blood, that rich, symbolic fluid of vampire fiction, but the subtler nourishments that the living take for granted. Breath warmth, sleep depth, the electrical vitality that animates living tissue. It feeds the way a sponge absorbs water passively, automatically, without conscious intent or satisfaction. Those who survive Strigoi feeding describe the experience in terms that have nothing to do with puncture wounds or blood loss. Instead, they speak of dreams where they cannot quite wake up, of sleep that brings no rest, of mornings when they feel as if they have been running all night through landscapes that make no sense. They describe the sensation of being watched by something that cannot quite remember how to see, of being touched by hands that have forgotten the difference between caress and consumption. The Strigoi remembers family connections, but not their meaning. It may return to its childhood home, may even recognize the faces of its living relatives, but it interacts with them as a spider interacts with flies, not from malice, but from simple, biological imperative. It needs what they have, takes what it can reach, and moves on when the source is exhausted, leaving behind only the empty shells of people who still breathe, but no longer quite live. The Silesian vampire investigations of the early 18th century provide the most detailed documentation of this consuming emptiness in action. Imperial commissioners, armed with the skeptical rationality of the Enlightenment, traveled to remote villages to investigate reports of the dead feeding on the living. Their reports, preserved in Austrian state archives, read like medical examinations of an impossible disease. The pattern repeats across dozens of cases. A villager dies under unremarkable circumstances, is buried according to local custom, and within weeks the community begins to waste away. Not from plague or famine or any identifiable cause, but from a gradual diminishment that affects entire family lines. Children become listless, adults lose weight despite eating normally, the elderly slip into a twilight state that is not quite sleep and not quite consciousness. When the graves are opened, the investigators find bodies that should be weeks into decay, but instead appear almost alive. Hair grown long, nails extended, flesh full and flushed. But more disturbing than their preservation is their position. Sitting upright, mouths open, burial clothes torn and partially consumed. Some have gnawed through their own arms, others have devoured their shrouds entirely. Still others seem to have tried to eat their way through the coffin lid. The Austrian officials, trained in law and administration, struggle to categorize what they observe. They measure and weigh and document with scientific precision, but their reports carry the bewilderment of rational minds confronted with irrational evidence. They note the lack of decay, the signs of feeding, the correlation between the corpse's apparent vitality and the village's decline, but they cannot explain the mechanism that connects these phenomena. What they are witnessing is not supernatural predation, but natural consequence, the inevitable result of incomplete death trying to complete itself through consumption. The hollow ones feed not from choice, but from compulsion, not from evil intent, but from existential necessity. They are like spiritual black holes, voids in the fabric of existence that draw everything within reach toward their empty centers. The energy vampires of Slavic folklore, creatures that drain not blood, but breath, not fluid, but force, represent the most sophisticated understanding of this consuming emptiness. These beings do not need to touch their victims, do not require physical contact or even proximity. Instead, they feed through the invisible connections that link all living things, the shared air of enclosed spaces, the emotional bonds between family members, the sympathetic resonance that makes one person's yawn trigger another's sleepiness. This is vampirism as spiritual thermodynamics, the inexorable flow of energy from fullness to emptiness, from completion to void. The hollow dead become heat sinks for the living, drawing warmth not from malice but from simple physical law. Energy always flows toward equilibrium, and the dead are infinitely cold. The victims of energy vampires describe symptoms that modern psychology might recognize as depression or chronic fatigue, but the folklore understands them as literal consumption. The sufferers feel hollow, drained, as if something essential has been siphoned from their core. They sleep more but rest less, eat more but gain no strength, breathe more but feel constantly short of air. Most disturbing of all, they begin to feel empty in the same way their predators are empty, not sad or angry or afraid, but simply vacant, as if the machinery of emotion continues to function, but the operator has stepped away from the controls. They go through the motions of life with mechanical precision, but no real engagement, and their families watch in horror as the people they love transform into hollow imitations of themselves. This is the true horror of the consuming dead. They do not merely kill, they convert, turning their victims into versions of themselves, spreading emptiness like a spiritual contagion that transforms the living into the merely animated. The medieval understanding of these creatures focuses not on their supernatural powers, but on their supernatural lacks. They cast no shadows, because shadows require substance, depth, something solid enough to block light. They show no reflections, because reflections need genuine existence to reflect. Their touch brings no warmth, because they have no internal fire to share. Their breath creates no mist, because it carries no life heat to condense in cold air. But perhaps most telling, they cannot cry. Tears require emotional depth, the capacity to feel loss, the complex integration of memory and meaning that produces grief. The hollow dead may go through the motions of weeping, their eyes may water, their shoulders may shake, but the performance is empty, mechanical, a biological response disconnected from psychological cause. They are creatures of appetite without satisfaction, hunger without fulfillment, need without the capacity to be filled. They consume endlessly because they cannot process what they consume, cannot transform matter into meaning, cannot convert the substance of others into the essence they have lost. The folklore describes them as growing larger with each feeding, their bodies swelling with stolen vitality, but this growth is merely accumulation, not integration. They become bloated with life force they cannot properly absorb, like spiritual diabetics, whose systems can no longer process the energy they desperately need. This is why the traditional protections against vampiric feeding focus not on weapons or barriers, but on completion and integration. Holy water represents wholeness. Blessed objects carry the fullness of sacred attention. Religious rituals create unity between intention and action. The hollow dead cannot process such completeness. It burns them not through divine power, but through simple incompatibility, the way a broken circuit cannot handle a complete electrical current. The consuming dead are not evil, but tragic, not predators but parasites, not monsters, but the broken remnants of incomplete lives trying desperately to achieve the wholeness that death should have provided. They feed because they must, consume because they cannot help themselves, drain the living because they cannot remember how to be properly dead. They are what happens when the hunger of the soul persists without the soul itself, when the need for completion continues after the capacity for completion has been lost. They are appetite without purpose, consumption without nourishment, the eternal, impossible attempt to fill an emptiness that has become too large and too broken to ever be satisfied. In the end, They consume themselves as much as others, trapped in an endless cycle of feeding that brings no fulfillment, growth that provides no strength, accumulation that achieves no wholeness. They are the living proof that hunger without the ability to be satisfied is not desire, but damnation, not appetite, but agony, not consumption, but the eternal, futile attempt to eat one's way out of non-existence. The woman in the white hospital gown stares at her husband with eyes that hold no recognition, no warmth, no flicker of the 23 years they have shared together. She knows his face, can describe it perfectly, identify him in photographs, recite facts about their marriage with clinical precision, but she cannot remember how it feels to love him. The neurologist calls it Capgras syndrome, a rare delusion where familiar people appear to be imposters, identical replicas with something essential missing. But the husband, watching his wife look through him with the polite attention she might give a stranger, knows a deeper truth. She has become one of the hollow ones, present, but not there, familiar, but fundamentally changed. The person he married is gone, and what remains wears her face like an ill-fitting mask. This is the fourth face of the hollow ones, not supernatural entities, but natural phenomena, the result of minds broken by trauma, bodies damaged by disease, souls fractured by experiences too overwhelming to integrate. The hollow dead of folklore may be ancient fears made manifest, but the hollow living walk among us still, their emptiness explained by medical textbooks and psychological journals, yet no less terrible for being understood. The medieval chronicles describe possession with the precision of clinical observation, sudden personality changes, voices speaking in unknown languages, knowledge of things the possessed person could never have learned. The afflicted writhe and convulse, their bodies contorting in ways that seem to defy anatomy, their faces transforming into expressions no human soul should be able to make. Modern neurology provides explanations that are no less disturbing for being scientific. Temporal lobe epilepsy can produce religious visions, speaking in tongues, the sensation of being invaded by foreign consciousness. Dissociative identity disorder fragments the personality into separate, often competing selves. Schizophrenia creates voices, delusions, the absolute conviction that one's own thoughts originate from external sources. But knowing the mechanism does not diminish the horror of watching someone you love transform into a stranger wearing a familiar face. The mother who suddenly speaks in her grandfather's voice, using words and knowledge she could never have possessed. The child who develops an adult cynicism overnight, losing the innocent joy that defined her personality. The husband who becomes cold, calculating, empty of the warmth that once made him the center of his family's world. These are the hollow ones created not by improper death, but by incomplete living, not by failed burial rituals, but by brains that cannot process the full spectrum of human experience. They are the walking wounded of existence itself, casualties of the endless war between consciousness and chaos. The phenomenon of catalepsy, the death-like trance that mimics mortality so perfectly that the living can be buried alive, provides the most literal explanation for tales of the returning dead. In an age before modern medical knowledge, before reliable methods of determining death, the cataleptic patient appears to die completely. Breathing becomes so shallow as to be undetectable. The pulse fades to nothing. The body grows cold and stiff as genuine rigor mortis. Imagine the terror of awakening in darkness, wrapped in burial shrouds, trapped beneath 6 feet of earth. The scratching sounds villagers attributed to the restless dead may indeed have been scratching, the desperate clawing of premature burial victims trying to escape their living tombs. The stories of corpses found turned over in their coffins, faces torn by their own fingernails, mouths filled with earth and blood, may not be supernatural horror, but the most natural horror of all, the absolutely human panic of being buried alive. But those who survive such experiences, pulled from their graves by grave robbers or chance excavation, often return as hollow versions of themselves. The trauma of premature burial, the hours or days spent convinced they were dead, the complete sensory deprivation of the tomb, can shatter the mind in ways that never fully heal. They may remember facts, faces, fragments of their former lives, but they cannot access the emotional resonance that gives these memories meaning. They have experienced death without dying, crossed the threshold between life and whatever lies beyond, and the journey changes them in fundamental ways. They return not as the people they were, but as survivors of an experience that should not be survivable, marked by an emptiness that their loved ones recognize but cannot name. The historical understanding of rigor mortis, decomposition, and the stages of death provides explanations for many supernatural manifestations. Bodies buried too quickly, before the full progression of death is complete, may indeed move, shift position, even appear to breathe as gases produced by decomposition escape through the mouth and nose. The medieval observers, watching a corpse seem to sigh or turn in its grave, naturally interpreted these movements as signs of unnatural animation. But the scientific explanation does not diminish the psychological impact on those who witness it. A mother watching her child's body move in the grave, a husband seeing his wife's corpse appear to breathe, a village observing their priest's remains shift position. These observers experience something that science can explain, but the heart cannot process. They have seen the dead refuse to stay dead, and the trauma of that witnessing can create its own form of hollowness. The families of the apparently reanimated often develop symptoms that mirror possession: loss of sleep, inability to concentrate, the sensation of being watched by empty eyes. They become hollow, not through supernatural infection, but through psychological trauma. Their minds unable to reconcile what they have seen with what they believe possible. Sleep paralysis provides perhaps the most widespread explanation for encounters with the hollow dead. The phenomenon occurs in the borderland between sleep and waking, when the mind is conscious but the body remains paralyzed. The sufferer lies trapped in their own flesh, unable to move or speak, while hallucinations, often of intruders, watchers, or familiar figures with wrong expressions, populate the darkened room. The medical mechanism is well understood. REM sleep and waking consciousness overlap, creating a state where dream imagery intrudes into perceived reality. But understanding the cause does not diminish the experience for those who endure it. They see the hollow ones with perfect clarity, family members who stand too still, friends whose faces lack proper expression, strangers who watch with the patient attention of predators. Most disturbing are the sleep paralysis episodes, where the hallucinated figure appears to be someone the sufferer knows intimately, a spouse, child, or parent, but wrong in ways that are impossible to articulate. The face is correct, the voice is accurate, the mannerisms are perfect, but something essential is missing. The observer lies paralyzed, unable to flee or fight, while someone they love looks at them with eyes that hold no love, no recognition, no humanity. These experiences often occur repeatedly, creating a pattern of nocturnal encounters with hollow versions of loved ones. The sufferer begins to fear sleep, to dread the darkness, to question whether the people in their waking life are real or merely better constructed versions of the empty watchers who visit their paralyzed hours. The phenomenon of dissociation, the mind's ability to disconnect from overwhelming experiences, creates hollow ones among the living. Severe trauma can fragment consciousness, leaving victims present in body but absent in spirit. They go through the motions of normal life with mechanical precision, but lack the emotional engagement that makes existence meaningful. Dissociative survivors describe the experience in terms that folklore would recognize. The sensation of watching themselves from outside their own bodies, of going through daily routines without fully inhabiting them, of feeling like actors playing roles in lives that don't quite belong to them. They are hollow not because they lack souls, but because their souls have retreated so far from traumatic reality that they can no longer fully occupy their own existence. The families of dissociative survivors often report that their loved one has become a stranger, a hollow copy of the person they once knew. The survivor may remember shared experiences, recognize familiar faces, even perform caring behaviors, but the emotional authenticity that once characterized their relationships is gone. They love without feeling love, care without feeling care, live without feeling alive. Capgras syndrome represents the most literal manifestation of hollow ones in modern psychology. Sufferers become convinced that familiar people, usually close family members, have been replaced by identical imposters. The recognition is perfect, the resemblance complete, but the emotional resonance that should accompany familiar faces is absent. The neurological explanation involves damage to the connections between facial recognition and emotional response. The brain identifies the face correctly, but cannot access the feelings associated with that person, creating the uncanny sensation that this must be someone else, a replica, a hollow copy of the real person. But for the families of Capgras sufferers, the explanation provides little comfort. They watch their loved one look at them with recognition but no warmth, acknowledge their presence but not their significance, treat them with the polite distance reserved for strangers. The person they love has become hollow not through supernatural intervention, but through neurological damage. Yet the result is the same. They are present, but not there. Familiar, but fundamentally changed. The uncanny valley effect, the psychological discomfort produced by things that are almost but not quite human, explains why encounters with hollow ones provoke such visceral fear. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to subtle variations in facial expression, voice tone, body language. We can detect minute differences that indicate genuine emotion versus performed emotion, authentic engagement versus hollow mimicry. The hollow ones, whether supernatural or psychological in origin, trigger this deep-seated recognition system. They are human enough to seem familiar, but wrong enough to activate our most primitive alarm responses. The face is correct, but the expression is off. The voice is accurate, but the tone is empty. The gestures are appropriate, but the timing is mechanical. This explains why encounters with hollow ones are so deeply disturbing, even when they involve no apparent threat. The observer's nervous system recognizes something fundamentally wrong with the interaction, something that suggests the presence of a predator or imposter. The fear response is not learned but instinctive, not cultural but biological. Grief hallucinations provide another scientific framework for understanding encounters with the hollow dead. Bereaved individuals often report seeing, hearing, or feeling the presence of their deceased loved ones. These experiences are so common that psychology considers them normal aspects of the mourning process rather than signs of mental illness. But the hallucinated dead are often wrong in subtle ways that mirror the hollow ones of folklore. They may appear too young or too old, speak in voices that are almost but not quite accurate, behave in ways that are characteristic but emotionally flat. The grieving mind, desperate to maintain connection with the lost loved one, creates a presence that resembles the deceased but lacks their essential vitality. The bereaved often report feeling simultaneously comforted and disturbed by these encounters. They are grateful for any contact with their lost loved one, but troubled by the empty quality of the interaction. The hallucinated dead provide the appearance of reunion, but not its substance, the form of comfort, but not its emotional nourishment. Anthropological studies reveal that cultures worldwide develop elaborate rituals around death, not merely from superstition, but from profound psychological understanding. The funeral rites, mourning practices, and commemoration ceremonies that every society develops serve crucial functions in helping the living process loss and maintain healthy boundaries between the world of the living and the memory of the dead. When these rituals are disrupted by sudden death, social upheaval, or cultural displacement, the psychological consequences can be severe. The bereaved may develop symptoms that folklore would attribute to supernatural haunting, sleep disturbances, sensory hallucinations, the persistent feeling of being watched or followed. Modern psychology recognizes these as normal responses to incomplete grieving, the mind's attempt to process loss that hasn't been properly acknowledged or integrated. But the experience for the sufferer is indistinguishable from supernatural encounter. They are visited by hollow versions of their loved ones, empty echoes that provide no comfort, no closure, no peace. The trauma of war, abuse, and extreme violence can create hollow ones among the survivors in ways that folklore would recognize. The personality fragments, the self-divides, essential aspects of humanity retreat so far from conscious awareness that what remains is a functional but empty shell. These trauma survivors often describe themselves in terms that echo the hollow dead of legend. They feel like ghosts, like empty vessels, like actors playing roles in lives that don't belong to them. They go through the motions of existence without fully inhabiting their own experiences, present in body, but absent in spirit. The families of severe trauma survivors often report that their loved one has become a stranger, a hollow copy of the person they once knew. The survivor may function normally, hold jobs, maintain relationships, even appear happy, but something essential is missing. The spark of authentic engagement that makes human interaction meaningful. The medical understanding of these phenomena provides explanations but not comfort, mechanisms but not meaning. Whether the hollow ones are created by neurological damage, psychological trauma, or supernatural intervention, the result is the same: the transformation of the familiar into the strange, the beloved into the empty, the human into something that wears humanity like an ill-fitting costume. The hollow living walk among us still, their emptiness documented in case studies and research papers, but no less terrible for being understood. They are the proof that horror is not always supernatural, that the most frightening transformations are often the most natural, that the hollow ones do not always come from graves, but sometimes from hospital beds, therapy sessions, and the quiet desperation of minds that have seen too much to remain whole. They remind us that consciousness is fragile, identity is provisional, and the distance between being fully human and merely appearing human is sometimes no greater than the space between one heartbeat and the next. The needle slides through the dead woman's lips with the sound of tearing silk, drawing the red thread tight until her mouth forms a perfect seal against the hungry darkness that might try to enter. The seamstress works by candlelight, her fingers steady, despite the cold weight of the corpse beneath her hands, stitching close the gateway through which breath once passed and through which something else might try to return. This is not cruelty, but kindness, not violence, but protection. The living understand what the dead have forgotten, that an open mouth is an invitation, a doorway left ajar for things that should not be allowed entry. The red thread burns against dead flesh like a line of fire, but it burns with the intention of love, the fierce protectiveness of those who cannot bear to watch their beloved transform into something hollow and hungry. Across Europe, in every village where shadows grow long and the wind carries whispers of unfinished business, the living have learned the same lesson. Death is not an event, but a process, and processes can be guided, shaped, completed properly with the right knowledge and the right tools. The rituals that surround death are not mere ceremony, but practical magic, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who have learned to fear the hollow dead and discovered how to prevent their creation. The binding of the jaw serves a purpose older than written memory. In life, the mouth is the gateway of the soul. Through it passes breath, words, laughter, tears, the sounds that mark the presence of consciousness. In death, if the mouth remains open, it becomes a portal through which the departing soul might attempt to return, confused by the familiar passage, drawn back toward the flesh it should have abandoned. But an open mouth in a corpse invites more than confused souls. It becomes a vacuum, a void, that draws in whatever fills the spaces between life and death. The hollow ones are born in these open spaces, in the gaps between breath and silence, in the moments when death leaves doors unlocked and unguarded. The thread that seals the lips must be red, the color of life, of blood, of the vital force that once animated the flesh. White thread suggests purity, innocence, the blank space that invites occupation. Black thread carries the weight of endings, of conclusions that might not be final. But red thread burns with the memory of life itself, creating a barrier that even the most persistent emptiness cannot cross. The old women who perform this ritual know the proper knots, the specific patterns that transform simple thread into spiritual barrier. 7 stitches for the 7 days of creation, 9 knots for the 9 months of gestation, 13 loops for the 13 moons that mark a year's passage from life to death to potential rebirth. Each stitch is both prayer and command. Stay sealed, stay closed, stay complete. The coins placed on the eyes serve a different but equally crucial function. In life, the eyes are windows through which the soul looks out upon the world and through which the world looks back into the soul. In death, if the eyes remain open, they become empty windows, vacant frames that invite occupation by whatever might be seeking a vessel through which to view the living world. The weight of the coins, copper pennies, silver pieces, sometimes gold for those who could afford such final extravagance, serves not as payment for some mythical ferryman, but as anchors for the eyelids, ensuring that the windows of the soul remain shuttered until the dangerous period of transition is complete. The metal carries its own protective properties. Iron repels the hollow dead, silver burns them, gold blinds them with its purity. But the choice of coins matters less than their weight, their presence, their function as seals against the emptiness that seeks entry through every available opening. The dead who rise with silver coins still covering their eyes cannot see the living world clearly, cannot navigate by sight toward the warmth they hunger for. They stumble through darkness of their own making, forever seeking, but never finding the light that might guide them back to completion. The practice of binding the toes speaks to a different understanding of how the hollow dead might attempt to return. The Germanic peoples, with their deep knowledge of the relationship between body and spirit, recognize that the extremities, fingers and toes, are the parts of the body that cool first, that stiffen earliest, that most quickly lose the warmth and flexibility of life. They are also the parts most likely to twitch, to move, to give signs of animation in the hours after apparent death. The binding of the toes with hemp rope or iron wire serves both practical and spiritual purposes. It prevents the corpse from walking should some fragment of animation return to the limbs, and it provides a physical anchor that reminds any confused soul fragments that this body is no longer suitable for habitation. The rope must be tied with specific knots, not the simple bows that might come undone, but complex patterns that tighten with struggle, that grow stronger under pressure. The hollow dead, lacking the intelligence to untie intricate knots, become trapped by their own attempts at freedom, bound more securely by every effort to escape. The bells sewn into the burial shroud or tied to the corpse's wrists serve as early warning systems, alarms that will sound if the dead should attempt to rise before the proper time. But they function on a deeper level as well, creating a constant reminder to any lingering consciousness that the body is no longer suitable for the living. The sound of bells in folklore and reality has the power to drive away hollow things, empty spirits, the echoes and fragments that cluster around incomplete deaths. The pure tone cuts through confusion, provides clarity, marks the boundary between what is real and what is merely echo. The dead who attempt to rise wearing bell-sewn shrouds announce their own wrongness with every movement, their return marked by a sound that belongs to celebration in life, but warnings in death. The iron nails driven into the coffin lid carry the weight of finality, the absolute command that what lies beneath should remain beneath. Iron, the metal of tools and weapons, of things made to last and cut and hold, has properties that the hollow dead cannot endure. It burns them with its solidity, its completeness, its absolute commitment to being exactly what it appears to be. But the nails serve a function beyond mere barrier. driven into the wood in specific patterns, crosses, pentagrams, spirals, the sacred geometries that different cultures use to mark the boundary between sacred and profane. They create a lid that is more than wood, a seal that is more than physical. The hammer blows that drive the nails into place echo like gunshots in the cemetery, each strike a command, a declaration, a promise that this death will be complete. The regional variations in protective rituals reflect local understanding of how death can fail and what specific protections are needed. In Germanic territories, where the Nachtzehrer gnaw through their burial shrouds, the dead are wrapped in nets of iron wire, in shrouds that become cages if the corpse should attempt to feed. The wire cuts into the flesh with any movement, making consumption painful, difficult, ultimately impossible. Slavic traditions focus on the binding of limbs, the use of hawthorn stakes to pin the body to the earth, the scattering of poppy seeds around the grave. The poppy seeds serve a cunning purpose. The hollow dead, lacking the capacity for selective attention, become compelled to count every seed before they can proceed. By the time they finish counting, if they ever do, dawn has come, and the light drives them back to their graves. The hawthorn stakes carry their own protective properties. Hawthorn is a threshold tree, blooming between seasons, bearing flowers that smell of death and fruit that sustains life. Driven through the heart or limbs of a corpse, hawthorn wood creates a bridge between worlds that the hollow dead cannot cross. They are trapped between life and death, unable to fully inhabit either state. Celtic practices emphasize the direction of burial, the positioning of the body to follow the path of the sun from east to west, the placement of the head toward the setting sun, to ensure that confused souls have a clear path toward the otherworld. Bodies buried facing the wrong direction, north toward the pole star, south toward the lands of the living, may find their souls unable to locate the proper path to the afterlife. The placement of mirrors in coffins, a practice found across many cultures, serves to redirect confused souls toward their proper destination. The hollow dead, seeing their own reflection, may remember what they have lost, may recognize their incomplete state and retreat from the world of the living. The mirrors also serve to trap any malevolent spirits that might attempt to inhabit the corpse. Caught in endless reflection, they become lost in their own emptiness. The special burial rites reserved for those who die badly, suicides, murderers, oath breakers, those who perish under suspicious circumstances, reflect the understanding that certain deaths are more likely to produce hollow returns. The crossroads burial ensures that confused spirits become lost in the multiplicity of paths, unable to choose a single direction toward home or rest. The burial face down ensures that if the dead should attempt to claw their way to the surface, they will only dig deeper into the earth. The placement of stones on the chest, back, and limbs creates a weight that increases with any attempt at movement. The more the corpse struggles, the deeper it sinks into its grave. But perhaps the most sophisticated protection is the practice of the closing ritual, performed differently in each culture, but serving the same essential function. The complete severance of the ties that bind soul to flesh, the formal declaration that the death is complete and final. In Germanic traditions, the closing ritual involves the symbolic breaking of all the dead person's tools, the extinguishing of their personal fire, the speaking of their name 3 times, followed by the declaration, "You are released." The breaking of tools ensures that the dead cannot return to their former occupations. The extinguishing of fire removes the warmth that might draw soul fragments back toward flesh. The speaking of the name provides one final moment of recognition before the formal release. Slavic closing rituals focus on the washing of the body with water that has been blessed and salted, the dressing of the corpse in clothes that have never been worn by the living, the placement of bread and salt in the coffin to sustain the soul on its journey. The washing removes the traces of life that might confuse a departing soul. The new clothes provide proper attire for a new existence. The bread and salt ensure that the dead will not return, seeking sustenance from the living. Celtic traditions emphasize the singing of the soul toward its destination. the creation of a musical pathway that guides the departed consciousness toward the other world. The keening women, with their ancient songs and practiced voices, create a bridge of sound that spans the gap between life and death, providing safe passage for souls that might otherwise become lost in the transition. But every tradition recognizes the importance of timing, the understanding that death is not instantaneous but gradual, requiring days or weeks to complete fully. The vigil kept with the dead, the practice of never leaving a corpse unattended during the dangerous period between death and burial, serves multiple functions. The presence of the living provides protection against malevolent influences that might attempt to inhabit an empty body. The continuous attention of loved ones creates a barrier of care and concern that hostile forces find difficult to breach. But more importantly, the vigil provides guidance for the departing soul, the reassuring presence of familiar voices and faces to light the way through the confusion of dying. The stories told during the vigil, the memories shared, the expressions of love and forgiveness help the dead remember who they were, what they accomplished, what connections they formed during their time among the living. This remembrance provides weight, substance, meaning, the very qualities that prevent a soul from fragmenting during its departure. When the vigil fails, when the dead are left alone during their most vulnerable hours, the risk of incomplete departure increases dramatically. Without the anchoring presence of the living, without the continuous reminder of their identity and significance, the dying consciousness may panic, may fragment, may attempt to cling to the familiar weight of flesh rather than trust itself to the unknown journey ahead. The hollow ones are born in these moments of abandonment, in the spaces between breaths when no one is watching, in the silence that follows the last heartbeat when no voice speaks the dead person's name. They are the casualties of insufficient love, inadequate attention, the terrible loneliness that transforms death from transition into trap. The protective rituals that surround death are ultimately expressions of love in its most practical form. Not sentiment, but action. Not emotion, but commitment. The red thread that seals the lips, the coins that close the eyes, the iron nails that secure the coffin lid, all serve the same purpose: to ensure that those we love complete their journey safely, that their departure is clean and final, that they do not return as hollow echoes of their former selves. The living who perform these rituals understand what modern medicine has forgotten: that death is not a medical event, but a spiritual transition, not a moment, but a process, not an ending, but a transformation that requires guidance, protection, and above all, love enough to let go completely. They stitch the mouths of their dead not from cruelty, but from compassion, weight their eyes not from fear, but from hope, bind their bodies not from hatred, but from the deepest form of care, the willingness to perform difficult, disturbing, necessary tasks to ensure that those they love find peace. The hollow ones haunt the edges of every cemetery, every funeral, every moment when the living must face the reality of death. But they haunt as warnings, not inevitabilities, reminders that death can go wrong, but also proof that with proper care, sufficient love, and ancient wisdom, it can also go right. The nurses at St. Mary's Hospital whisper about the woman in room 314, the one who flatlined for 7 minutes during surgery and came back wrong. Her vital signs are perfect, her recovery ahead of schedule, her responses to medical questions appropriately coherent. But when her husband visits, she looks at him with the polite interest she might show a stranger, and when her children cry at her bedside, she tilts her head like a bird, hearing sounds it cannot understand. Her name is Margaret. She remembers being a teacher. She can recite her address and social security number without hesitation. But when asked about her wedding day, she describes the ceremony with the detached precision of someone reading from a textbook. The love that once animated her voice when speaking of her family has been replaced by something else. Not coldness, exactly, but an absence where warmth should be. a hollow space where connection once lived. The hollow ones did not disappear with the advent of electric lights and modern medicine. They simply adapted, learned to wear contemporary faces, to walk among us in forms we almost recognize but cannot quite trust. They are the patients who return from near-death experiences, fundamentally changed. The accident survivors who remember their names but not their loves. The victims of severe trauma who function perfectly but feel nothing at all. This is the final face of the hollow ones, not ancient horrors from medieval chronicles, but present dangers living in suburban houses, working ordinary jobs, sitting beside us on buses and in waiting rooms, wearing the faces of our neighbors and sometimes of ourselves. The phenomenon of clinical death and resuscitation has created a new category of the hollow living, those who cross the boundary between life and death and return with something essential left behind. Medical science can restart the heart, restore breathing, revive brain function, but it cannot guarantee that what returns is complete, that all the scattered pieces of consciousness successfully reassemble in the restored body. Margaret's husband describes the change in terms that folklore would recognize. She goes through the motions of their marriage with mechanical precision, cooking the same meals, sleeping on the same side of the bed, even responding to physical affection with appropriate sounds and movements. But the emotional resonance that once characterized their relationship is gone, replaced by a performance so perfect it becomes uncanny in its emptiness. She remembers their shared experiences, but cannot access the feelings associated with them. Their first kiss, the birth of their children, the death of her mother, all are recalled with the same neutral tone, the same detached precision. She knows these events shaped her life, but cannot remember how it felt to live through them, cannot access the emotional significance that transforms mere experience into meaningful memory. The doctors explain it as a side effect of prolonged oxygen deprivation, temporary damage to the emotional centers of the brain, a condition that may improve with time and therapy. But her family knows a different truth. The Margaret who died on the operating table took something with her that cannot be restored, cannot be replaced, cannot be medically treated, because medicine does not recognize its absence. This is what the modern hollow ones have in common with their ancient predecessors. They are incomplete returns, fragments of people wearing their whole faces, echoes of personalities that have lost their essential resonance. The doppelganger sightings that pepper urban folklore follow patterns that have remained consistent for centuries. A woman sees her exact double standing at a bus stop, wearing clothes she owns but does not remember losing. A man encounters his identical twin in an elevator, complete in every detail except for the eyes, which hold no recognition when they meet his gaze. A child spots her perfect replica, playing alone in an empty playground, moving with her gestures but lacking her vitality. These modern fetch encounters share the same characteristics as their folkloric ancestors. The double is physically perfect but spiritually vacant, familiar in every detail but wrong in ways that bypass rational analysis and trigger primitive alarm responses. The observer knows, with the certainty that comes from deep instinct rather than surface logic, that they are looking at a hollow version of themselves. The digital age has provided new frameworks for these ancient fears. The uncanny valley effect, originally identified in robotics, describes the revulsion humans feel when confronted with artificial beings that are almost but not quite human. The closer the artificial approaches the real, the more disturbing the subtle differences become. A crude robot is harmless, even charming, but a near-perfect android triggers deep unease, activating evolutionary alarm systems that recognize the presence of predators or imposters. The hollow ones exist in this same uncanny valley, human enough to seem familiar, but wrong enough to activate our most primitive warning systems. They are the social equivalent of computer viruses, malformed copies that appear functional but corrupt everything they touch with their fundamental incompleteness. Social media has created new forms of hollow existence, new ways for people to fragment themselves across digital platforms until their online presence becomes more real than their physical being. The influencers who craft perfect lives from carefully staged photographs. The trolls who exist only as vessels for hostility and chaos. The bot accounts that mimic human interaction with algorithmic precision. All represent modern forms of the Hollow Ones. These digital Hollow Ones lack the physical presence of their folkloric ancestors, but share their essential characteristics. They perform the motions of human interaction without genuine engagement, respond to stimuli with mechanical precision, consume attention and energy without providing meaningful exchange. They are presence without substance, interaction without connection, humanity without human content. The phenomenon of sleep paralysis continues to provide the most widespread modern encounters with hollow entities. The medical explanation, REM sleep intrusion into waking consciousness, provides mechanism but not meaning for those who experience these visitations. They lie trapped in their own bodies, while familiar figures with wrong expressions stand at the foot of their beds, watching with the patient attention of those who have all the time in the world and nothing meaningful to do with it. The sleep paralysis entities often take the forms of family members, friends, or intimate partners, but they are always wrong in ways that transcend physical description. A mother might see her son standing in the doorway, every detail perfect except for the smile, which carries no warmth, no recognition, no trace of the love that should illuminate such expressions. A husband might observe his wife sitting in the bedroom chair, identical in every way, except for the eyes, which hold the flat attention of a hunting cat. These encounters follow patterns that have remained consistent across cultures and centuries. The hollow figure appears during the vulnerable hours between sleep and waking, stands or sits in positions of observation rather than interaction, and watches with an intensity that suggests purpose without revealing intent. They are present but not there, familiar but fundamentally alien, human in form but hollow in substance. The most disturbing aspect of modern sleep paralysis encounters is their persistence. The same hollow figures return night after night, sometimes for years, the creation of ongoing relationships with observers who cannot move, speak, or escape. The paralyzed observer becomes intimate with these empty watchers, learning their subtle variations in expression, their preferred positions in the room, their habits of approach and departure. Some sufferers report that their hollow visitors begin to appear in waking life as well, glimpsed in peripheral vision, reflected in windows, standing in crowds of strangers. The boundary between sleep paralysis, hallucination, and waking encounter becomes blurred, creating uncertainty about which experiences are real and which are neurological artifacts. Death doulas and hospice workers, those who professionally guide the dying through their final transitions, report encounters that folklore would immediately recognize. They speak of patients who seem to die peacefully, surrounded by family, blessed by clergy, given every care that modern medicine and ancient wisdom can provide. Yet something goes wrong in the final moments. The dying person's breathing stops, their heart ceases, their brain activity flatlines, but their eyes remain open, staring at something no one else can see. The family celebrates the peaceful passing. The medical staff records the time of death. The funeral arrangements proceed normally. But the hospice workers know that something incomplete has occurred. Some essential process has failed to reach its conclusion. These incomplete deaths often produce visitations in the days and weeks that follow. Not the peaceful presence that grieving families sometimes report, but something else. Something that wears the deceased's face, but lacks their warmth. Family members describe seeing their loved ones standing in familiar places, performing familiar actions. But when they approach, the figure turns away, disappears, or worse, looks at them with no recognition whatsoever. The death doulas recognize these as cases where the dying process was interrupted, where some trauma or attachment prevented complete departure. The person died physically but not spiritually, leaving behind a fragment that continues to inhabit familiar spaces without understanding why. These partial returners are not malevolent, but lost, confused echoes seeking completion they cannot achieve and rest they cannot find. Rural communities, particularly in Eastern Europe and the American South, maintain traditions that acknowledge the continuing reality of hollow ones. In remote villages of Romania and Hungary, certain families still practice the old protections, nailing shut the mouths of the dead, placing mirrors in coffins, refusing to speak the names of the recently deceased for fear of calling them back before their departure is complete. These communities report ongoing encounters with empty returners, family members who appear at windows during storms, neighbors who are seen walking roads they traveled in life, children who play in abandoned houses but flee when approached by the living. The encounters follow folkloric patterns. The hollow ones appear most often during times of transition, storms, eclipses, the hours between midnight and dawn, and they always seem to be seeking something they cannot name or find. Modern investigators who study these communities often dismiss the reports as cultural superstition, products of isolation and inadequate education. But the consistency of the accounts, the specific details that match historical folklore, the genuine fear displayed by otherwise practical people, suggests something more complex than simple ignorance or imagination. The investigators who spend time in these communities, who listen carefully to the stories and observe the protective rituals still practiced, often report their own encounters with phenomena that challenge rational explanation. They see figures that disappear when approached directly, hear footsteps that follow no visible walkers, experience the unmistakable sensation of being watched by eyes that hold no human consciousness. These modern encounters share characteristics with historical accounts. The hollow ones appear in familiar forms but lack familiar substance. They interact with the living world but cannot meaningfully engage with it. They seek something from the living but cannot communicate what they need or why they need it. Psychological trauma continues to produce hollow ones among the survivors of severe abuse, war, natural disasters, and other overwhelming experiences. The therapeutic term dissociation describes the mind's ability to disconnect from unbearable experiences, but the folklore understanding may be more accurate. Trauma can shatter the soul, scattering pieces so widely that what remains is insufficient to fully inhabit human existence. These trauma-induced hollow ones walk among us in numbers that would horrify the medieval chroniclers. They hold jobs, maintain relationships, perform the functions of normal life with competence and consistency, but something essential is missing. They are present but not there, functional but not alive, human in form but hollow in substance. Their families often report the same disturbing recognition that marks all encounters with hollow ones. The person they love is present but fundamentally changed, familiar but somehow alien, responsive but not truly there. The trauma survivor may remember shared experiences, recognize familiar faces, even express appropriate emotions, but the depth that once characterized their personality is gone, replaced by a performance so convincing it becomes uncanny in its perfection. The most tragic aspect of these modern hollow ones is their own awareness of their condition. Unlike their folkloric predecessors, who were unconscious of their incompleteness, contemporary hollow ones often understand exactly what they have lost. They can describe the absence of feeling, the inability to connect, the sensation of watching their own lives from outside their own bodies. They become experts at mimicking human emotion, at performing the roles that social interaction demands, at hiding their emptiness behind carefully constructed facades. But the performance exhausts them, the constant pretense of being fully human, when they feel only partially present, the endless effort required to simulate feelings they can no longer access. The technology of modern surveillance has begun to document phenomena that folklore predicted but could not prove. Security cameras capture figures that appear human but cast no shadows, mirrors that reflect empty space where people should be standing, digital recordings where voices speak but create no sound waves, where images appear on camera but register no heat signatures on thermal sensors. These technological anomalies follow patterns that match historical accounts of Hollow Ones. They are captured most often during transitional times and in threshold spaces. They appear in places associated with death or trauma. They interact with the physical world in ways that suggest presence without substance. The digital evidence remains fragmentary, ambiguous, open to alternative explanations involving technical malfunction or environmental interference. But the consistency of the anomalies, their correlation with reported encounters, their appearance in multiple independent recording systems, suggests that modern technology may finally be providing objective documentation of phenomena that folklore has described for millennia. The Hollow Ones have not disappeared with the advent of electric lighting and modern medicine. They have simply learned to wear contemporary faces, to walk among us in forms we almost recognize but cannot quite trust. They are the patients who return from clinical death fundamentally changed, the trauma survivors who function perfectly but feel nothing, the social media personas that perform humanity without possessing it. They remind us that the human soul remains as fragile now as it was in medieval times, that consciousness can still fragment under pressure, that death can still go wrong despite all our medical advances. They are proof that some fears are too fundamental to be eliminated by technology, too deeply rooted in human experience to be explained away by scientific understanding. The Hollow Ones walk among us still, and they are not ancient history but present danger. Not folklore but fact, not medieval superstition, but modern reality wearing an updated mask. They are the people who seem perfectly normal until you look closely at their eyes and see nothing looking back, the neighbors who go through all the motions of human life, but somehow never quite seem to be fully alive. They are what we fear we might become if we die badly, live incompletely, or lose so much of ourselves to trauma and pain that what remains is insufficient to justify the name human. They are the Hollow Ones, and they are us, or what we might become if we forget that being human requires more than simply appearing human, that consciousness is earned and not guaranteed, that the soul itself can break under pressures too great for flesh and spirit to bear. In the end, they are not our enemies but our warnings, not monsters but mirrors, not the opposite of humanity, but its broken reflection. They show us what we might lose if we are not careful, what we might become if we are not strong, what we might leave behind if we are not complete. The Hollow Ones are eternal because the human capacity for incompleteness is eternal, because trauma and death and the shattering of consciousness are constants in human experience, because the distance between being fully alive and merely appearing to live is sometimes no greater than a single heartbeat. A moment of inattention, a fragment of soul lost in the darkness between worlds. They are the proof that horror is not always supernatural, that the most frightening transformations are often the most natural, that the monsters we fear most are not the ones hiding in shadows, but the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing familiar faces and carrying empty hearts.